you use fiction to comment on reality when reality currently seems so fantastic?
Yeah, well, it's a question I think many of us have been asking ourselves. I mean, I had dinner with Ian McEwan a few nights ago, and we were agreeing that if we had written down what has really happened in the world and offered it to our publishers as a novel, the publisher would have turned it down for being too unbelievable. So the truth is stranger than fiction line has never been more true. And I think what happens is that writers can perhaps in a way be the truth tellers in a moment when there's so much fakery around.
Well, you mentioned truth in your answer, and the subject of truth is so central to this moment. Do you still have faith in an objective, verifiable truth?
Well, I think there's always been an argument about the truth. That truth is different for different people. That's always been the case. There's a degree of subjectivity, but there are things that are objective. There are things that are so, and other things that are not so. And I think when we're talking about the very large scale of what's happening in a society, it's very important, I think, that people in a society have some broad agreement about the nature of reality. Otherwise, it's a very dangerous thing.
You do capture in The Golden House this sort of topsy-turvy reality that we're living. You have this character called the Joker who runs for the US president. You write that suddenly lying was funny and hatred was funny and bigotry was funny. And, they're things that we previously didn't find even remotely amusing.
Yeah, I mean, it's become very black, the comedy in America now. And there's a line in the novel where one of the characters says that it's as if DC, that's to say comics, has taken over DC, that's to say Washington. And as if we're in the business of being ruled by grotesques and cartoons. And that's why the words Donald Trump don't occur in the novel, but there is this Trump-esque version of Batman's archenemy instead.
I sometimes wonder if ridicule is used enough as a weapon, because a lot of what we see in politics is genuinely ridiculous, and nothing inflames people with gigantic egos more than being ridiculed.
Well, I agree with that, and I think actually one of the things that I admire right now in America is the way in which comedians are doing that, the way in which Saturday Night Live and John Oliver and Bill Maher and Stephen Colbert and Samantha Bee, all these figures are using comedy as a way of getting and actually making quite serious political points, but also getting under the skin of a notoriously thin-skinned president.
Next year is the 30th anniversary of the publication of the Satanic Verses, and yet here we are all these years later, and the politics of offence and Islamist extremism are once again front and centre. How do you think things are different now, though?
Well, what's happened in the last 30 years is the rise of a whole wave of terror attacks which weren't happening in the same way 30 years ago, and we have to combat those. But I also, I just think one has to hold on to one's principles, and one has to hold on to the idea that we have the right to talk about whatever we like and criticize, as you were saying, satirize any form of power, whether secular or theocratic. And we just have to push on.
You personally have had to endure huge sacrifices in the name of that belief. How does it make you feel in this day and age just to therefore see American colleges hound out people with politically incorrect viewpoints, or this advocacy of so-called trigger warnings?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken out against all that stuff. I think it's pretty absurd. I think universities are safe spaces for thought, not safe spaces from thought, and. I also think that it is somewhat exaggerated, the amount of this stuff that's going on, because I teach at New York University, NYU, and before that I taught in Atlanta at Emory University, and I go around America lecturing at quite a lot of colleges, and I have literally never encountered a single student who has talked in this way, who has demanded safe spaces or trigger warnings, or who wants to deplatform people, or etc. So I know there is some of it going on, but there's also an enormous amount of the American Academy where it doesn't go on, and where actually my students, when these subjects are brought up, are quite contemptuous of that kind of point of view. So I think let's not overstate what's going on.
What do you think about this idea that a person's identity is central to the credibility of their argument?
what is interesting to me about the subject of identity is first of all, that it is so vividly alive in people's minds right now. And secondly, that it doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. So in India, for example, which is where the Goldens come from originally, the subject is really about religious identity. When you talk about identity, you're talking about Hindu-Muslim issues. In America, you're really talking more about race and gender issues. And right at this moment, you're talking about actually what is it to be an American in the age of Trump? What is America? What is the America that he wants to make great again? And what I worry about is that in all of this, and the novel goes into this somewhat, is that we're being asked to narrow our identities, to define our identities more and more narrowly as sort of one thing, this and not that. Whereas actually anybody who reads novels and anybody who loves novels knows that human beings aren't like that, that human identity is actually very multiple and complicated and even contradictory, and that's what makes us rich characters. That's what makes us interesting as human beings, that we are many things, not one.
You speak of people who love novels. I think it's fair to say your most loved novel is Midnight's Children. How does it make you feel to know that now it's being read by people who weren't even alive when you wrote it?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the point of doing this kind of thing, I think, because I think if you're my sort of writer, what you hope to do is to write books that will endure and that will, if you're lucky, outlast you. So, I mean, I think the fact that Midnight's Children, which is whatever it is, 36 years old, is still, has some meaning and interest for young people who weren't, as you say, weren't alive when I wrote it. I mean, that feels like the biggest prize of all, and the one or two of the other books, which are as old as that, or almost as old as that, are beginning to have the same experience. I mean, the Satanic Verses, which, as you said, is coming up for 30, is finally allowed to have the ordinary life of a novel, and people can read it as a novel and discover that a lot of people read it and discover that it's funny. One of the things that nobody ever said about that book at the time is that it was funny, because what happened to it wasn't funny. And now people are discovering that it's actually many ways quite a comic novel. So, I mean, I love it that my books go on being interesting. It would be very sad if they were just to disappear and be forgotten.
Well, great pleasure to speak to you about your new novel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.